Episode 9, Voluntaryism and its Christian Roots.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my faith from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words to the new behind. I'm coming up from underneath the red, from underneath the faith.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I will be discussing voluntarism and its Christian roots. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. We haven't received any new ratings or reviews since the last recording, so if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know and letting other users know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episode. It'll help us reach more listeners and grow the show. You can also help grow the show by becoming a patron through Patreon. And since the last recording, we did not gain any new patrons. But if you are interested in supporting us with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways to support us. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. All right, on with the episode. Whether or not if you're familiar with the term voluntarism, I think you'll find this episode informative. Voluntarism seems like a relatively new term, but it's not. And it's gaining a lot of traction in anti-state and libertarian circles. On its surface, it's a more positive sounding term when compared to other terms that we find favorable like anarchism or anarcho-capitalism. And in this episode, I want to give you a brief but thorough intro to the subject, as well as some names that you'll be introduced to as we also listen to an awesome reading of an awesome essay that really shines a light on Christianity's role in its start. So, what is voluntarism? Voluntarism is simply the philosophy that all forms of association are to be voluntary. Oberon Herbert coined the term in the late 1800s. He wrote many good articles, and the most notable being The Right and Wrong of Compulsion by the State. It's in the public domain, so you can find it online, but there are also some great paperbacks, and I'll have our Amazon affiliate link in the show notes for the more analog audience like myself that still wants to hold books and smell the paper and all that good stuff. So, every interaction is voluntary. Sounds moral to me. It sounds like something Christians should support. It sounds easy. And most people would probably immediately agree with that. But how does it play out? Herbert wrote that government should never initiate force, but be, quote, strictly limited to its legitimate duties in defense of self-ownership and individual rights, end quote. And to be consistent in not initiating force, they should maintain themselves only through, quote, voluntary taxation. He stressed using this force only in defense and opposed the idea that the initiation of force could become legitimized by forming a majority. He said, quote, neither an individual nor a majority nor a government can have rights of ownership in other men, end quote. This should be in line with any Christians reflecting on the way that we should act, and especially the way that we should interact with other people. The most basic attempt at loving our neighbor and our enemies seems to fit squarely with not taking ownership of them or their property against their will. And I doubt you'll find many self-professed Christians that would argue this point. However, with a brief jog through public and political policies, you will immediately find most Christians advocating actions directly contrary to what they've just agreed to. But was that always the case? In the short essay on the history of the word voluntarism by Karl Wagner, I was introduced to a group predating Herbert called the Levelers. This is the essay that I mentioned at the start of the show. And in it, we'll hear that the Levelers held fast to a theory of natural rights as coming from the law of God expressed in the Bible, and would clash with the Presbyterian Puritans of their day that wanted to preserve a state church that held coercive powers and would deny the liberty of worship to other Puritan sects. The Levelers were more of a political movement that sprung up during the English Civil War of the mid-1600s. One of my favorite Leveler quotes is from Richard Overton. I think all of us should keep this in mind when weighing how involved all Christians, and just people in general, how involved anyone should be in society. Overton said, "No man hath power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man." This comment just puts it so well, how everyone desires to be left alone by governing authorities, but also how we need to respect others, treat them as we want to be treated. Also, as the Levelers went in and out of prison, they printed pamphlets that demanded a voluntary tithe to the state church. Voluntary tithe. But as movements tend to come and go, so did the Levelers. Wagner jumps us into the mid-1800s England, where we see a large Baptist pushback on mandatory education by the state and the official church, in which we see Edward Baines deliver this description of a voluntary system. Its very essence is liberty. It offends no man's conscience, exacts from no man's purse, favors no sect or party, neither enforces nor forbids religion in the schools, is open to all improvement, denies to no person the right of teaching, and gives to none the slightest ground for complaint. It is as just and impartial as it is free. In all these important respects, it differs from systems which require the support of law and taxation. Now, eventually, voluntarism, ignited by these men and coined by Herbert, would spring up again in the late 20th century. It's uncanny to see the religious loyalties to the church's mandatory tithe tax and crony support with the state, and the zeal in today's church to have its dogma enforced rather than be voluntary. Wagner ends with a brief passage from a Connecticut minister, Lyman Beecher, as he reflects in his biography on the eventual separation of the church and state. Beecher expected the worst from this establishment. The floodgates of anarchy would be loosened in Connecticut. The injury done to the cause of Christ, as we then supposed, was irreparable. This supposition was soon challenged by a new revolutionary idea, and true religion might stand on its own without support from the state. Quote, "Our people thought that they should be destroyed if the law no longer supported the churches. But the effect, when it did come, was just the reverse of the expectation. We were thrown on God and ourselves, and this made the church stronger." As well, Beecher's final conclusion was that the tax law had for more than 20 years really worked to weaken us and strengthen our opponents. I can't help but think about that and think about how it's just such a different perspective what our churches have today. Their reliance on their tax-free status, the reliance on the state. And even here, we see a man commenting that he went from the regulation and the support of the state to seeing that removed, and how not only was it better prosperity-wise, but their faith. They'd thrown themselves onto God rather than the state. And I think that it's just something that we see over and over again once we look back on it honestly. So with that little background on some of the names that are leading up to and the events of Watner's essay on the history of the word voluntarism, I'm now going to play an episode from Essential Libertarianism. It's a podcast from Roger Paxton that is an excellent resource. Roger reads all the essays from voluntarist.com that you wish you had time to read, but now you can just listen to them on your way to work or jogging or wherever it is that you're consuming your podcast. If you do not currently subscribe to Essential Libertarianism, stop what you're doing, pause the show, and subscribe to it. I'll wait. All right, now that you're back and everybody's subscribed to it, we'll listen to something from the back catalog. This is episode 10, Carl Watner's article on the history of the word voluntarism.
Welcome to Essential Libertarianism, selected readings from voluntarist.com. Essential Libertarianism is voluntarism. Let's reclaim the anti-political heritage of this philosophy together. The essays and books we read in this show will bring us closer to the state-free voluntary society that we desire. Let's begin the journey.
On the History of the Word Voluntarism by Carl Watner. This article first appeared in whole number 130 of the Voluntarist. It appears here in a slightly altered version. There is no way to know what voluntarism might accomplish today or tomorrow, but on moral, historical, and even practical grounds, we have every reason to think that our experiences would parallel that of Beecher's, which are mentioned in the final paragraph of this article. Voluntarism has a rich past, and hopefully an even brighter future. Voluntarism has a long historical tradition in the English-speaking world. Our first sight of modern usage is from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia found on the World Wide Web. Voluntarism. In politics and economics, the idea that human relations should be based on voluntary cooperation to the exclusion of political compulsion. A journal is published based on these ideas, The Voluntarist, www.voluntarist.com. The new shorter Oxford English Dictionary offers the following definitions, citing usage that dates back to the 1830s. Voluntarism, the principle that the church or schools should be independent of the state and supported by voluntary contributions. Voluntarist, an advocate or adherent of voluntarism or voluntarism. However, voluntarism has roots deeper than the early 19th century. The purpose of this article is to show the connections between 21st century voluntarism and its intellectual heritage, which can be traced at least as far back as the Leveller movement of mid-17th century England. The Levellers can be best identified by their spokesman, John Liburn, 1614 to 1657, and Richard Overton, 1600 to the 1660s, who, quote, clashed with the Presbyterian Puritans, who wanted to preserve a state church with coercive powers and to deny liberty of worship to the Puritan sects, end quote. All the Leveller thinkers were nonconformist religious types who agitated for the separation of church and state. During the 16th and 17th century, the church covenant was a common means of organizing the radical religious sects. This was sometimes an explicit congregational agreement by which those enrolling in a particular church pledged themselves to the faith. The church, to their way of thinking, was a voluntary association of equals. To both the Levelers and later thinkers, this furnished a powerful theoretical and practical model for the civil state. If it was proper for their church congregations to be based on consent, then it was proper to apply the same principle of consent to its secular counterpart. For example, the Leveler Large Petition of 1647 contained a proposal, quote, that tithes and all other enforced maintenances may be forever abolished, and nothing in place thereof imposed, but that all ministers may be paid only by those who voluntarily choose them and contract with them for their labors, end quote. One only needs substitute taxes for tithes and government officials for ministers to see how close the Levelers were to the idea of a voluntary state. The Levelers also held tenaciously to the idea of self-proprietorship. As Richard Overton wrote, quote, "No man hath power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's," end quote. They realized that it was impossible to assert one's private right of judgment in religious matters, what we would call today liberty of conscience, without upholding the same right for everyone else, even the unregenerate. These ideas were embraced in Scotland by John Glas, a Dundee minister who challenged the establishment church of the Covenanters. Glas taught that there was no scriptural warrant for a state church, that the civil magistrate should have no authority in religious matters, and that the imposition of a creed against unbelievers was not a Christian thing. What appropriately became known as the Secession Church began when Glas and 3 other ministers left the Scottish State Church and formed the First Associate Presbytery in 1733 near Kinross. As W.B. Selby wrote, quote, "It, the Secession Church, was a voluntary church, dependent on the free will offerings of the people and independent of any state control," end quote. In an extensive discussion of voluntarism published in Chambers' Encyclopedia, reference is made to the, quote, "voluntary controversy which sprung up in the second decade of the 19th century between churchmen and dissenters in Scotland," end quote. There, the voluntarists held, quote, "that all true worship must be the free expression of individual minds. Therefore, religion ought to be left by civil society to mold itself spontaneously according to its own spiritual nature and institutions," end quote. This should be done, quote, "without violence to individual freedom from any interposition of secular authority or compulsory influence," end quote. These religious voluntarists held that, quote, "the only weapons of the church are moral and spiritual. The weapon of the state is force," end quote. They believed that the, quote, "church was never so vital, so convincing, so fruitful as in the first 3 centuries before her alliance with the state," end quote. Back in England, from about the mid-1840s to the mid-1860s, voluntarism became a force to be reckoned with in another sphere. In 1843, Parliament considered legislation which would require part-time compulsory attendance at school of those children working in factories. The effective control over these schools was to be placed in the hands of the Anglican Church, the established Church of England, and the schools were to be supported largely from funds raised out of local taxation. Nonconformists, mostly Baptist and Congregationalists, were alarmed by the Factories Education Bill of 1843. They had been under the ban of the law for more than a century. At one time or another, they could not be married in their own churches, were compelled to pay church rates against their will, and had to teach their children underground for fear of arrest. They became known as voluntarists because they consistently rejected all state aid and interference in education, just as they rejected the state in the religious sphere of their lives. 3 of the most notable voluntarists included the young Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, who was to publish his first series of articles, The Proper Sphere of Government, beginning in 1842, Edward Baines, Jr., 1800 to 1890, editor and proprietor of the Leeds Mercury, and Edward Meall, 1809 to 1881, Congregationalist minister and founder-editor of the Nonconformist, 1841, who wrote Views of the Voluntary Principle in 1845. The educational voluntarists wanted free trade in education, just as they supported free trade in corn or cotton. Their concern, quote, "for liberty can scarcely be exaggerated," end quote. They believed that, quote, "government would employ education for its own ends," end quote, teaching habits of obedience and indoctrination, and that government-controlled schools would ultimately teach children to rely on the state for all things. Baines, for example, noted that, quote, "we cannot violate the principles of liberty in regard to education without furnishing at once a precedent and inducement to violate them in regard to other matters," end quote. Baines conceded that the then current system of education, both private and charitable, had deficiencies, but he argued that freedom should not be abridged on that account. Should freedom of the press be compromised because we have bad newspapers? Quote, "I maintain that liberty is the chief cause of excellence, but it would cease to be liberty if you prescribed everything inferior," end quote. Baines embraced what he called the voluntary system, which included, quote, all that is not government or compulsory, all that men do for themselves, their neighbors, or their posterity of their own free will. It comprehends the efforts of parents on behalf of the education of their children, of the private schoolmaster and tutor for their individual interests, of religious bodies, benevolent societies, wealthy benefactors, and cooperative associations, in the support of schools, and of those numerous auxiliaries to education, the authors and editors of educational works, lecturers, artists, and whoever devotes his talents in any way to promote the instruction of the young without the compulsion of law or the support of the public purse. Its very essence is liberty. It offends no man's conscience, extracts from no man's purse, favors no sect or party, neither enforces nor forbids religion in the schools, is open to all improvement, denies to no person the right of teaching, and gives to none the slightest ground for complaint. It is as just and impartial as it is free. In all of these important respects, it differs from systems which require the support of law and taxation." End quote. Although educational voluntarism failed to stop the movement for compulsory schools in England, voluntarism as a political creed was revived during the 1880s by another Englishman, Auberon Hebert, 1838 to 1906. Hebert served a 2-year term in the House of Commons, but after meeting Herbert Spencer in 1874, decided not to run for re-election. He wrote State Education, A Help or Hindrance in 1880 and began publishing his journal The Free Life, Organ of Voluntary Taxation in the Voluntary State in 1890. Hebert advocated a single, monopolistic state for every given geographic territory, but held that it was possible for state revenues to be generated by offering competitive services on the free market. Some of his essays are titled The Principles of Voluntarism and Free Life, 1897, and A Plea for Voluntarism, posthumously, 1908. Although the term voluntarist practically died out after the death of Auberon Hebert, its use was renewed in late 1982 when George Smith, Wendy McElroy, and Carl Watner began editing The Voluntarist. George Smith, after publishing his article 19th Century Opponents of State Education, suggested use of the term to identify those libertarians who believed that political action and political parties were antithetical to their ideas. In Neither Bullets Nor Ballots, Essays on Voluntarism, Watner, Smith, and McElroy explained that voluntarists were advocates of non-political strategies to achieve a free society. They rejected electoral politics, quote, in theory and practice, as incompatible with libertarian goals, end quote, and explained that political methods invariably strengthen the legitimacy of coercive governments. In concluding their statement of purpose, they wrote, quote, voluntarists seek instead to delegitimize the state through education, and we advocate the withdrawal of the cooperation and tacit consent on which state power ultimately depends, end quote. Although there was never a voluntarist movement in America till the late 20th century, earlier Americans did agitate for the de-establishment of government-supported churches in several of the original 13 states. Such people believed that the individual was no longer automatically to become a member of the church simply by reason of being born in a given state. Their objection to taxation in support of the church was twofold. Taxation not only gave the state some right of control over the church, it also represented a way of coercing the non-member or the unbeliever into supporting the church financially. In New England, where both Massachusetts and Connecticut started out with state churches, many people believed that they needed to pay a tax for the general support of religion, for the same reasons they paid taxes to maintain the roads or the courts. It was simply inconceivable to many of them that society could long exist without state support of religion. Practically no one comprehended the idea that although governmentally supplied goods and services might be essential to human welfare, it was not necessary that they be provided by the government. In Connecticut, the well-known Congregational minister Lyman Beecher opposed de-establishment of the state church, which was finally brought about in 1818. In his autobiography, Beecher admits that this was a time of great depression and suffering for him. Beecher expected the worst from disestablishment. The floodgates of anarchy would be loosened in Connecticut. Quote, the injury done to the cause of Christ, as we then supposed, was irreparable, end quote. The supposition was soon challenged by a new revolutionary idea, that true religion might stand on its own without support from the state. Quote, our people thought that they should be destroyed, end quote, if the law no longer supported the churches. Quote, but the effect, when it did come, was just the reverse of the expectation. We were thrown on God and ourselves, end quote, and this made the church stronger. Quote, before we had been standing on what our fathers had done, but now we were obligated to develop all our energy, end quote. Beecher also noted with elation the new alignment of religious forces which was the result of disestablishment. By repealing the law that compelled everyone to pay for the support of the church, quote, the occasion of animosity between us and the minor sects was removed, and the infidels could no more make capital with them against us, end quote. On the contrary, quote, they began themselves to feel the dangers from infidelity and to react against it, and this laid the basis of cooperation and union of spirit, end quote. Beecher's final conclusion was, quote, that the tax law had for more than 20 years really worked to weaken us, end quote, and strengthen our opponents.
Thank you for listening to Essential Libertarianism. You can check out the archives of all of our episodes at essentiallibertarianism.com. And you can subscribe to future episodes on any podcatcher, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and more. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
Well, I hope you liked this episode on voluntarism and its Christian roots. I hope it inspires you to look further into the philosophy of voluntarism and to take some pride in the foundation that our Christian ancestors made in a philosophy that is currently gaining a lot of traction, and the term is being used more and more today. So, if you like this episode, please like and share on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and iTunes. And please consider leaving us ratings and reviews or supporting us through Patreon. And again, I'll have the Amazon affiliate link up for some of the books that I mentioned. And if you purchase those books through Amazon or do any of your shopping through Amazon through that link, it'll give us a small commission and at no additional charge to you. So, until next time, grace and peace. No king but Christ.
From underneath the pain to bring a new day, to bring a new day, God.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.